In this day's lecture, we're going to be talking about America under the Articles of Confederation. And this refers to the pivotal moment between the American Revolution and the creation of the U.S. Constitution. So remember that the revolution started in 1776. However, the U.S. Constitution was not in place until 1788. So really our question for today's lecture is what happened in between, and perhaps more importantly, why don't we remember it? We're all familiar, of course, with the U.S. Constitution, but we forget that there was a period before the Constitution was in place, and in many ways the Constitution was a response to this period. So we're going to be exploring what kind of government the U.S. had in this transitional period, and more importantly, why it didn't work and why ultimately it was replaced with the constitutional form of government that we still use today. Okay. So, the Articles of Confederation is the first governing document of the brand new United States. It was drafted by Congress in 1777 and ultimately ratified in 1781. Now, keep in mind that for much of that time, America was still at war. So, the Articles of Confederation really sought to balance out the need to fight a war with the need to have a government framework of some kind. However, there were a couple of important considerations in creating the Articles of Confederation. First is, and I think we can understand this, is that America, after living so long under Britain's thumb, was really afraid of creating another powerful centralized government. They saw that as being too similar to the government that they had been fighting a war against, which was, of course, Great Britain. So the Articles of Confederation, instead of being really sort of one government, was really a union of 13 individual states. And each of those maintained its own sovereignty, its own freedom, and its own independence. All right. So a better way to think about the Articles of Confederation is really sort of a loose union of 13 individual states. So the Articles of Confederation had only a one-house Congress, and every state, no matter how big or how small, got one vote in that one-house Congress. To make sure that the central government would not get too powerful, any major decisions had to be approved by 9 of the 13 states. Now, it's important to note that that's not a simple majority. A simple majority would have been 7 out of the 13, right? Because half of 13 is 6 plus 1 is 7. So they were actually making it even harder than a simple majority to actually make any major decisions. The only explicit powers the new American government had under the Articles of Confederation were those that were needed, of course, to fight the war, the American Revolution. So it had the power to conduct foreign affairs, it had the power to draft treaties, that kind of thing. But almost all of the other possible government functions that it might have had, it didn't have, right? So, for example, under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. government had no power of taxation, which meant it had no way to raise money. The assumption was that individual states would chip in to help fund the federal government, but the government in and of itself, under the Articles of Confederation, had no power of taxation and thus no power to raise funds. Now, for a while, this system seemed to work well enough, right? It got us through the remainder of the war. It got us through the first couple of years after the war. And so what we're going to be talking about on the next screen are some of the things that this one-house Congress under the Articles of Confederation was actually able to accomplish. And then we'll move on and talk about some of the problems with the Articles of Confederation. Okay. So one of the main successes of the new U.S. government under the Articles of Confederation dealt with land, particularly all of that new western land that was gained in the war. Remember, the Ohio Valley and sort of all of that land east of the Mississippi River that had belonged to Britain has now been transferred to the United States as part of the settlement of the war. And so one of the first items of business of the brand new American government was to basically establish control over it. Now, initially, that land was given to individual states. So Virginia, the Carolinas, Connecticut got these huge masses of Western land added to them. In fact, theoretically, the boundaries of these states were understood to extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In reality, they didn't because, of course, the Pacific half of the United States is still under the control of Mexico in this period. But at least theoretically, you now have these enormous states being created because they've gotten the land east of the colonies, but west of the colonies, but east of the Mississippi added to them. Understandably, of course, though, some other states were upset that it was unfair that suddenly Connecticut was so big and the Carolinas were so big. So instead, that new land was transferred back to the national government. So it is the national government who now has control over all of that new territory from the Ohio Valley on south. So, understandably, now that there is all of this new land that the federal government needs to manage, they need to deal with a couple of issues. One, of course, are the indigenous peoples who are still there. And the other is, of course, exactly what to do long term with these new lands. So one of the things they do with indigenous peoples is, and this shouldn't surprise you based on what we've talked about so far in this class, is that the national government begins to force many indigenous groups to cede their lands to the United States on the grounds that any group that had fought on behalf of the British was an enemy and therefore their land was now forfeit. Now, of course, as we talked about a while back, there are in fact indigenous groups on both sides of the Revolution. There were indigenous groups that fought on the side of the Americans. But what this is basically is it's an excuse. It's a very convenient excuse that the new United States uses to tell indigenous people, no, you have to give up your land to us because you were on the wrong side during the war and you've lost, right? And of course, while that's going on, you begin to see white settlers from the older colonies moving into these western lands. So moving into upstate New York, into the Appalachian Mountains, what will become Kentucky and Tennessee. So at the same time indigenous groups are being pushed out, you're seeing white settlers moving in. The only difference is now the white settlers are not coming from England. They're instead coming from older colonies, more eastern colonies, and now they're moving westward. Now, how are they going to govern these new lands? Well, under the Articles of Confederation, that one-house Congress does manage to pass a set of bills that give sort of an orderly process for how the federal government is going to deal with these new lands. The first of this is the Ordinance of 1784, and that's important for us because it basically establishes stages of self-government for the West. And remember, at this point, what they consider the West is still actually east of the Mississippi. What we think of the West today, California, Colorado, all of that, as I mentioned, is still under the control of Mexico. So to a colonial American, the West is, the Ohio Valley, Western New York, Western Carolinas, but still east of the Mississippi. Okay, so the Ordinance of 1784 really says two things. It says that these new lands will first be divided into districts governed by Congress. So the first step will be to set up a government where basically Congress, the national government, was managing the governmental affairs of these new lands. But that the plan would be to eventually admit these new lands to the unions as states. So from 1784 on, it's understood that eventually those new lands will become new states of the United States. That's followed a year later by the Ordinance of 1785, and this one dealt specifically with the Ohio Valley. But again, it's important for us because it sets up a procedure that, in fact, the United States will follow for many, many decades. So the Ordinance of 1785 was specifically regarding land sales in the Ohio Valley. And just to confuse you, the Ohio Valley was what was called the Old Northwest in the late 18th century. For us today, of course, when we think about the New West, the Northwest, we think about Washington and Seattle and Portland, Oregon. But again, remember, we're still talking east of the Mississippi. So if you'd asked somebody in the 1790s where the Old Northwest was, they would have said the Ohio Valley. Okay, so land sales are being regulated, and this is how the new national government decided they would handle the sale of land. So they would survey it, and then it would be divided up and sold in sections of 1 square mile. And a square mile is 640 acres. And you could buy the land for $1 an acre. So it's basically trying to set up an orderly process for how those lands would be divided up and sold. As part of that, because remember, there's a big emphasis on public education in the wake of the American Revolution, the Ordinance of 1785 also requires each new township has to set aside 1 acre of land to fund public education. So in other words, there has to be one piece of land set aside that could be sold, and the proceeds could be used to pay for a school for the community. Now, it's important to note, though, that by today's standards, of course, $1 an acre sounds like a ridiculous bargain. But in the late 18th century, those prices were still too high for most farmers. Most farmers still couldn't afford to pay $1 an acre. So in reality, most of the new farmers moving into the Ohio Valley or Kentucky, Tennessee, they're actually still having to buy their land from land speculators, and in many cases, they're buying much, much smaller tracts of land. They're not buying 640 acres. They're possibly only buying a couple of acres from a speculator because they cannot afford the prices set by the federal government. Of the 3 new laws, the Ordinance of 1784, the Ordinance of 1785, the most important one for our purposes, I think, is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And remember, again, when I talk about the Northwest Ordinance, we're referring specifically to the Old Northwest. So basically, this laid out specifically what was going to happen to the Ohio Valley as land was being sold, as people began to settle there. So first it said there would be anywhere from 3 to 5 states north of the Ohio River that would eventually be carved out of that sort of big mass that was simply called the Ohio Valley. So anywhere from 3 to 5. And more importantly, that once they were states and once they joined the Union, they would have equal power within the nation. And this is an important precedent because they could have said that, no, the old colonies, the original 13 states, had all the power and any later states would have less. But instead, in 1787, the United States makes a commitment that as new states are added, those states are added on an equal footing with older states. And that's, of course, the procedure that's been used for all, well, what we now have, 50 states. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 also required that land be obtained legally from Indians. As always, there are problems with that, which we will talk about. But it did basically say that there had to be legal methods of obtaining Indian land before it could be sold. And perhaps most importantly for the long term, Northwest Ordinance of 1787 also says that slavery would not be permitted in the Old Northwest. So as it goes from being a territory to being anywhere from 3 to 5 states, they will be free states. They will be states where slavery is not allowed. And basically, that's going to add further fuel to this emerging sectional split we've already seen, where increasingly northern states are going to be free states and southern states are going to be slave states. Okay, so if you're looking for successes of the national government under the Articles of Confederation, those 3 ordinances are probably about the best you're going to do. On the other hand, there are quite a few more problems than there were positives coming out of the Articles of Confederation. So we're going to talk about some of the problems with the Articles of Confederation that are specifically going to get people rethinking this type of government that they had created. Okay. So in no particular order, these are some of the issues that appear almost immediately with the new national government under the Articles of Confederation. The first is that, as we've already talked about, there's a lot of economic fallout from the Revolution. The government of the brand new United States really struggles for the first couple of years after the war because, of course, it owes these massive debts and there's problems with inflation, all of that. Now, at the same time, though, new global markets are opening up to the United States, of which the most valuable will be China. For the first time, the United States is establishing trade with China, which has all sorts of luxury goods, porcelain dishes, which come to be simply called China for short, because that's where they come from, tea, silks, spices, opium, all sorts of really valuable products. So there's an economic slump after the American Revolution, but on the bright side, there are these new international markets being opened up for trade, particularly the very, very valuable China trade, as it becomes known. The problem, though, is that under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to set any kind of economic policy. When it came to sort of determining the monetary future of the country, Congress had no power at all to do that. Instead, individual states created their own economic policies. So Massachusetts might have one set of economic policies, Pennsylvania might have another, and North Carolina might have another, and South Carolina might have another. And as you can probably guess, and particularly those of you who might be business majors will know, that basically that creates chaos, because it's very hard to do business when you have all of these different rules and regulations and policies in place. It's very hard for really anyone to want to do business with a country where the policies literally change the minute you move from one state to another. So you have different states setting their own economic policies. So, for example, some states charge tariff duties on imports, which of course made them more expensive, but others didn't. So in some states, you paid less for an imported good than you did in another state. Some states printed and circulated their own paper money. So they had their own currency in addition to the national currency. Other states didn't do that. So at a time when the United States really sort of needed to focus on economic growth, and particularly on the promise of these new markets in Asia, it can't do that because there's no one body sort of governing and setting and determining economic policy for the nation. Instead, you have 13 different states making 13 different sets of rules about everything. And it creates a huge amount of chaos in the business community. And that's, of course, not something the business community wants. They want stability and consistency so that trade operates the same regardless of where you go in the United States. And that is just not happening under the Articles of Confederation. In fact, that can't happen under the Articles of Confederation. In addition to problems economically, there also is a moment where it almost looks like there's going to be open rebellion against the new government. It doesn't happen, but it comes close. And that's an episode called Shays' Rebellion. Now, Shays' Rebellion is rooted in all of that economic upheaval I just talked about. As part of sort of the fallout and the economic issues that come out of the American Revolution, a lot of farmers in particular were very hard hit by the economic downturn. In fact, many of them were losing their land because they couldn't pay their mortgages anymore. It was particularly bad in Western Massachusetts. And so in Western Massachusetts, it got so bad that, in fact, residents there began to rebel against the courts. And this is an episode that today we remember as Shays' Rebellion. So in the winter of 1786 and 1787, there were supposed to be a whole series of court cases working their way through the courts in Western Massachusetts, dealing with bankruptcy, dealing with farmers who hadn't paid their bills and therefore needed to, at least in the eyes of the law, surrender their land. But these farmers, who are very angry and, of course, very fearful about what will happen to them if they lose their land, in that winter basically force the local courts to close. They basically show up as mobs to make sure that the courts can't operate. And if the courts can't operate, the courts can't seize anybody's land for loss of payment. They call themselves regulators as sort of a local movement. And regulators, that term had been used before actually in a similar incident in the western part of the Carolinas as well. But they call themselves regulators because they see themselves as standing up for the little guy, standing up for the small farmer. It's called Shays' Rebellion because one of its leaders was a local farmer by the name of Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays was a farmer in Western Massachusetts, but he was also a veteran of the American Revolution. And so he was one of these people who very clearly saw, here we fought a war that was supposed to be about independence, and yet my neighbors are losing their land and there's something very, very wrong with that. Now, of course, to the authorities, this is very scary because anytime you see mobs, I mean, so far no one had actually been hurt, but anytime you see mobs descending on courts to make sure the courts can't do their business, that's understandably very alarming for authorities. So what ultimately happens with Shays' Rebellion is the governor of Massachusetts, a guy by the name of James Bowdoin, actually sends out force. He actually sends out armed men to disperse the crowds, disperse the mobs at the end of January 1787. And understandably, the regulators at that point basically sort of fold up and go home because now they have the armed authority of the state of Massachusetts keeping an eye on what they're doing. So Shays' Rebellion ends with really no bloodshed. But for the larger purposes of American history, it's a very frightening moment, right? It's a very frightening moment, or at least a potentially very frightening moment, because it looked for a minute there like these men, these regulators in Western Massachusetts, were either going to just ignore the state government or possibly could have fight back. There could have been open conflict. Now, the responses to Shays' Rebellion depended a little bit on who you asked. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson, who at this point in time was an ambassador to Paris. So he only heard about Shays' Rebellion from thousands of miles away in Paris. But he actually wasn't too worried about it. He actually thought as being sort of a healthy expression of democracy. This is where he gave his very famous quote, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Right? Now, you could say it's very easy for Thomas Jefferson to say that when he's thousands of miles away in Paris. But some people saw this as, okay, it was a little bit alarming, but nothing bad happened. And after all, the revolution had been about liberty and people standing up for their rights. And so there's nothing to get too excited about with Shays' Rebellion. On the other hand, you had a lot of other people who are genuinely alarmed, right? Yes, nothing horrible came out of Shays' Rebellion, but it could have. What if Shays' Rebellion was a sign of things to come? What if there are more of these sort of mob uprisings? How is the federal or the state government supposed to respond to that? And so it starts a conversation about whether or not Americans should rethink the way they had set up the national government. In other words, rethink the Articles of Confederation. Maybe they needed to go back to the drawing board. In particular, the central issue here is it possible for democracy to go too far? Can democracy go far enough to actually be dangerous? Okay. And up until this point, remember, it's been all about the American Revolution and liberty and how positive small d democracy is. But coming out of sort of the economic upheaval, and particularly coming out of Shays' Rebellion, now you have at least some Americans saying, well, wait a minute, maybe it's actually possible that there's such a thing as too much democracy. Maybe too much democracy that goes far enough is actually potentially dangerous. And, for example, James Madison, who will be very important to our story over the next couple of lectures, also a Virginian like Jefferson, reached a very different conclusion than Jefferson did. After hearing about Shays' Rebellion and reflecting on what might have happened, James Madison very famously wrote that liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as abuses of power, right? That, yes, of course, abuses of power are dangerous and damaging to liberty, but so too was perhaps having too much liberty. That, when it escalates to the point where you have mobs attacking courts so that the courts can't carry out their job, is that not perhaps a sign that liberty has gone too far, at least in that case? So very, very different responses to Shays' Rebellion, but enough people are now concerned about this instability coming out of the Articles of Confederation that they decide the time has come to actually do some rethinking about the national government in particular and how it functioned. Now, the key people behind this come to be identified as the nationalists, and it's very important to note that, like so many other terms we've talked about in this class, nationalist in the 18th century means something very different than the term means today. Okay, So at the core of this emerging group of nationalists in the young United States was James Madison, who we just talked about, wealthy planter, very well educated from Virginia. Alexander Hamilton, who I'm sure you are familiar with, if for no other reason than you may be a fan of the musical. Madison and Hamilton in particular become sort of the mouthpieces, the spokespeople, the thinkers behind those individuals making the argument that, yeah, the Articles of Confederation are not working as well as they should, and we really need to replace them possibly with something else. Hamilton in particular was very interested in the economic development of the United States. And in particular, he wanted to see the United States become a very strong economic and diplomatic presence in the world. And Hamilton argued the only way that could happen would be under a stronger national government, that the only way the United States was really going to live up to her potential was to have a stronger national government than it had under the Articles of Confederation. So along with James Madison, Alexander Hamilton will be hammering out a lot of these new potential ideas for what the government could and perhaps should be, as opposed to what it was as of the mid-1780s. Now, in addition to elites like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, other people who became nationalists, in other words, became advocates for a stronger national government, were artisans. These were people who made things. Maybe you were a carpenter and you had a furniture store, or you were a silversmith or something like that. So artisans are people who make things. And in particular, what artisans objected to were those tariffs on imports and exports from the United States. Because obviously, if you are producing something for sale, inconsistencies in tariff policies are really going to hurt you, because if you need, raw materials shipped in and you happen to live in a state that have tariffs, you might have to pay them, but if you live in another state, you don't, because the economic policies are a mess. So a lot of artisans, a lot of small manufacturers are increasingly interested in these nationalist ideas about having a stronger national government. And Hamilton and Madison and these artisans were sort of added by another group, which is that people who were just in general afraid. They were afraid that states' rights and individual rights states' rights in particular, could trample individual rights, right? These were folks who were really worried about what if a state made a law that impinged on somebody's individual rights? And obviously what they're really concerned about are property rights, because keep in mind that at this point, the vast majority of Americans are still farmers. So when they talk about rights, really what they're most interested in are property rights. So, what if you live in a state that passes some law that says it can confiscate your property? Who's going to protect you from that kind of thing? So those folks are also drawn to this idea of having some kind of stronger central government that would be able to protect the individual if a state decided to do something in defiance of that person's individual rights. And in general, anybody interested in sort of greater stability were sort of drawn to this nationalist movement. So, for example, a lot of former officers who had served in the Continental Army who really want to see sort of a peaceful, stable United States, a lot of them become advocates as well for this idea of the nationalists. So, again, keep in mind that the term is used differently in the late 18th century than we use it today. In this time period, all we're talking about is that a nationalist is simply someone who is advocating for a stronger, more centralized national government, and that's it. Okay? So, as with so many other terms, just be a little careful as far as not using it in the modern way we use it. We're using it specifically in that 18th century meaning. But again, the nationalists emerge in many ways responding specifically to what they see as weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. So, first step is to gather everybody back together to have a conversation about what they're going to do about all of this. So in September of 1786, delegates from 6 states meet up in Maryland, and they decide that what they need is another meeting. So they set up another meeting, this one to be held in Philadelphia, with the plan to try and fix the Articles of Confederation. So initially the idea is just to fix, to tweak, to adjust the Articles of Confederation. Now, of course, that gathering, scheduled for Philadelphia, becomes, of course, the famous Constitutional Convention. So every state but Rhode Island sends delegates to the meeting in Philadelphia. Present are, of course, some of the major movers and shakers. George Washington was there. Benjamin Franklin, who I should mention is by now 81 years old, is there. Madison is there. Jefferson and John Adams are both notably absent because both of them were serving as ambassadors at that point in time. But just about everybody else that has been a major player in our story up until this point is there at the meeting in Philadelphia to see if they can perhaps salvage the Articles of Confederation. Now, it really is a remarkable group of men, and it is all men, by the way. There's a couple of things I think worth emphasizing about the men gathered in Philadelphia to work on this issue with the Articles of Confederation. So they're all male. Obviously, they're all white. I think that would almost go without saying in the late 18th century. They're also all wealthy by the standards of the day. They're all much wealthier than your average American was in the 1780s, either through property ownership. So you have a lot of people like Washington who owned estates, owned slaves, or they had careers like law. They were lawyers, or they were some kind of professional individuals. So even though the vast majority of Americans at the time were small farmers, those are not the men who are at the Constitutional Convention. The men at the Constitutional Convention are the elites, the creme de la creme. And they were also much better educated on average than most Americans at the time. Remember, this is a time period where even though public education is increasingly available, not everybody even has the opportunity to go to school. And yet at this time, more than half of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention have the equivalent of today a college education. So they are exceptionally well educated as well. So we have this very elite, very well educated, all white, all male sort of group of men who are going to be making these decisions. And the reason I'm harping on that is because a lot of the issues that they will tackle will be rooted specifically in who they are, and we will come back to that in a moment. Now, interestingly enough, all deliberations at this convention were taking place in private. They felt very strongly that they could not be honest with each other if they were not guaranteed of secrecy. Okay, so they wanted to make sure everyone could express themselves freely, and so in order to do that, all deliberations took place behind closed doors. There was no public, no reporters, nothing like that. The reason we know now so much about what took place at that convention is that Madison took notes. You gotta love James Madison. Madison took scrupulous notes. He wrote everything down. But the deal was that the notes would not become publicly available until the last man who had been at the Constitutional Convention passed away. And in 1840, Madison, who is the last founding father at that point alive, dies. And it's at that point that the notes of the Constitutional Convention are released to the American public, and we learned so much about what actually went down at that meeting. But I want you to imagine that for a moment. Imagine trying to do that today. Imagine trying to have this serious conversation, this group of individuals who've sort of closeted themselves off in private, and they're making decisions about the functioning of government without anyone else participating in the conversation. So I think it's really interesting how we might feel about something like this today. Obviously, in the 18th century, no one really objected to what they were doing. But I think it would be remarkable if a conversation of this magnitude were to take place behind closed doors today. I think the public would have a very, very different attitude than Americans did in the 1780s when this group was meeting. So, very early on in this meeting, it comes down to a question of, can the Articles of Confederation be salvaged? And by May, the decision was they could not be. that rather than trying to sort of edit or adjust the Articles of Confederation, what these men needed to do was to scrap it and make something completely new instead. Okay? Now, of course, that something new will turn out to be the United States Constitution. And that's something we're going to explore in depth in our next lectures.